I didn't think I could still do that. Joe and Mary, on the whole, I think it's better that you go see the polar bears and they come here to see us. So, good luck. Good.
We won't bring any back.
Okay, very good. As long as I have the podium, I want to mention one other thing. There's a film playing downtown in the Coyote Twin called Detroit. Those of you that follow films, it's a serious film by the same people that brought us The Hurt Locker and 30 Dark. Have we got that right? Dark 30. Two very well-respected films. This one is about the conditions in Detroit, 1967, and the relationship between the police force and the African-American community, which is still, as you all know, an issue in this country. The Diversity Center at the university has bought out the theater Thursday night for the final showing at 7 o'clock for students. So any student with an ID gets in free, and other people will be able to attend as well. So if you're interested in serious films and an issue like the relationship between the police and especially the African-American community, we would welcome you to come. Okay, my job here is to introduce Randell Beck. Randell and I have some shared roots. Both of us have roots in rural Kansas. Randell began his education with an unfortunate experience at Kansas State University, where he majored in things other than academic subjects, and eventually moved on to the University of Missouri, where he took a degree in journalism, became a professional journalist very successfully in a number of assignments around the country, arrived in Sioux Falls about 2001, where he and his wife Linda have made their permanent home, and I think consider themselves gold-plated, solid, highly rooted South Dakotans at this stage in their life. He is currently the Director of Community Relations for Avera McKinnon Hospital. Until his retirement in 2013, he was first executive editor and then president and finally publisher at the Argus Leader in Sioux Falls. Under his leadership, the newspaper gained a national reputation for investigative reporting and coverage of First Amendment issues relating to government transparency. Beck joined the Pulitzer Prize Board in 2008 and served until 2017. His final year, which coincided with the centennial of the Pulitzer Prizes, Beck was co-chair of the board. He is married to a much smarter and much better looking Linda Beck, and they have 4 children. It's my pleasure to introduce Randell Beck, who will answer some questions, but nothing to do with sports coverage in the Argus Leader. Let's make that clear. Randell.
I wasn't ready for that jab at my less than stellar academic career, but it's actually true. Well, thank you. Really am thrilled at the invitation to be here to join you today. Hope that it won't disappoint you to learn that among the many things I learned from Bill Janklow when he was governor. It was an interesting part of my career to get to know Bill in a dynamic way, and in many different many different levels. But one of the things that I learned from Bill, watching him, and others I'm sure in this room did as well, is he did more speaking engagements than probably anybody in South Dakota history, and he had a kind of a way that he refined over the years, appearing before you name it group that really boiled down to about a 2 or 3 minute intro, and then he would open it up for questions. That was Bill's sort of style, and he really did it remarkably well, and was gifted in sort of that give and take and the Q&A. And so today, what I'm going to try to do is pattern myself a bit in approach to Bill. So I'm going to kind of give you just sort of a high-level view of why I'm standing up here, my experience briefly with the Pulitzer Prize Board, and then open it up for you and your questions. And this is a college campus, and it's a college town, and so you have, I know, thoughtful questions, and so don't let me down, Ted. Don't let me down, and so be thinking about those questions. I am here to tell you that every April, usually around the second week or so, a press conference is held on the campus of Columbia University in New York, announcing the newest winners of the Pulitzer Prize. 21 categories of prizes each April are announced, 14 in journalism and 7 in the arts, literature, drama, music. And together, those 21 awards acknowledge, recognize, call out the finest in American excellence, if you will, in those disciplines. And for well over a century, the Pulitzer Prizes, I know you know, have earned a reputation for singular achievement in everything from biography to fiction to journalism, certainly, but the other categories of music and drama, and those prizes for those lucky enough to win, it literally is a life-changing event. If you're a struggling historian, you're a struggling novelist, winning the Pulitzer Prize is the difference between no one knowing you and everyone knowing you. And the stories are legion over the century of these prizes, literally shining lights on people who were often producing great work, but in the dark corners of their chosen profession, and this really transformed both their career and often changed the trajectory of that particular discipline. So the Pulitzer Prizes continue after a century to have literally a transforming effect on both those in the disciplines and on really on the American experience. My involvement with the prizes began in 2008 when I received a call on a Friday night at home from the guy who I later realized was the chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, inviting me to join a group of 16 people who have the awesome responsibility and privilege of selecting the winning work for the Pulitzer Prizes. When I got off the floor and literally ran up to tell my wife, I began to ask myself, why me? The short answer to that question, because you're thinking the same thing, is that I was lucky enough, in part, to be the right person at the right time. The Argus Leader had, over time, and when I was there, gained something of a national recognition for, especially among smaller to mid-sized newspapers, at doing work sort of above their weight. The projects that we tackled, the topics we sought to shine a light on, sometimes the court battles we waged, not just got to sort of raised the ire of politicians and became sort of attention points in South Dakota, but got the attention nationally. We're lucky enough to sort of win some prizes that really got a number of us at the Argus Leader a great deal of attention, and that included myself. And so the year before I had been recognized as editor of the year by the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And so my name was sort of rattling around out there. You don't apply, in case you're thinking, Don, of applying for the for a position on the Pulitzer Prize Board. You don't apply. Your name sort of comes to the board. There's a vacancies committee that literally vets people often for years. My name had sort of been vetted and considered and debated for about 2.5 years before the vote was taken and I was extended the invitation. And it happens like that to this day, and that's sort of the tradition going back to the very beginning. And so I became the first South Dakotan to join the board, and it remains, certainly in my professional life, really a terrific honor. What I discovered over the next 9 years, because joining the board almost is a lifetime commitment, it seemed like at the time when I was in the middle of it, what you sign up for is an experience that I would equate to being in the world's best book club. Because you read an enormous amount, more than they ever warn you in advance, and you find yourself at the table, literally and figuratively, with some of the brightest minds in this country, whether it's drama or journalism or historians, biographers, people of the first rank, people who have really distinguished themselves in their careers. And so it became for me this guy from South Dakota, this rural Kansan, if you will, a singular experience, and I was able to sort of overcome an initial, I think, trepidation and insecurities. It didn't take long to get over the insecurities, and found myself literally arguing about books with some of the most accomplished people in those disciplines. It was truly an experience, and over 9 years was lucky enough to be at the table for some really important decisions. I brought up a couple of props, just 2 books that over my time were memorable books to me, that were, one was a winner, one was not. But what I discovered through sort of these 2 props, one is a book that may be well familiar to many of you. I'm sure Don and Tina, and I see nods around the room. Annette Gordon Reed, Professor Annette Gordon Reed, wrote really the first book based on more than 15 years of research about really what happened behind the curtain at Monticello, and really revealed for the first time Jefferson's sort of secret relationships with Sally Hemings and others, slaves in that household, and really revealed in 2008, I believe it was, for the first time, sort of the cracks in the wall for Thomas Jefferson, a much hallowed figure in our nation's history. The Sun, and it won the Pulitzer Prize that year in history, as it should have. The other is called The Sun. More recently, I think it was around 2010 or so, was a fiction entry that, to my mind, was one of the finest examples of fiction writing that I'd seen both in my life and on the Pulitzer board. But because I found myself on the losing side of that argument, it was an also-ran. It was one of three finalists for the award that year. And it lost out, I believe, to a book called The Orphan Master's Son. And some of you may know this. It was written by a guy named Adam Johnson, who was actually born in South Dakota, I believe in Vermilion. Didn't necessarily claim today South Dakota is his home, but was born here, and the Sun lost out to him that year. What I'm trying to sort of say through those 2 anecdotes is that being in this best book club of the world requires a number of things. It requires a confidentiality. All of our conversations are confidential, and no notes are taken, and what happens in that room on the campus of Columbia University stays stays in that room, arguments back and forth, the debates, and what comes out, the votes do recognize our majority, sometimes very close, sometimes 8 to 7, sometimes 9 to 8, acknowledgement of the finest in work, and it's just a simple majority vote in all but one of the categories. So it's really an example of democracy at work, even on that group of really distinguished people. I was calculating just the other day in preparation for these remarks, trying to calculate in my head how many words I may have read being on the board over my 9 years. But first, let me tell you a bit about the process. And then I'm going to tell you how much I believe that I read. The process is this. For each of the disciplines, let's say feature writing and journalism, let's say editorial writing, let's say history, let's say fiction writing, the board selects a jury. Usually 4 to 5 people, experts in that particular field, to sift down usually between 250 to 300 nominations for that particular award to 3 finalists. They spend the entire year reading in their spare time and present to the board, usually around November or December, 3 finalists in each of those 21 categories. It becomes the board's job then to read all of the 3 finalists in the 21 categories. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that doesn't seem so bad. I totaled up what I believe to be, and these would be average length book entries. The journalism doesn't seem to you, and it didn't seem to me before I joined the board, that it would be nearly as long or as, and sometimes laborious, but I found some of the entries to be equally as long as a good book. So I calculated the other night, roughly over 9 years, and those finalists, between 30 and 40 million words. Is what I read. Somewhere in there, I think, is pretty close. Well, I don't know where you come from or your point of reference or how much reading you do, but that's a whale of a lot of words. And my wife would say that for those 9 years, beginning around the 1st of December, you maybe, if we're lucky, we might get a couple of books by Thanksgiving. Until the 1st of April, she became a Pulitzer widow. I read constantly. I would read at night. I would get up early in the morning, usually a couple of hours early in the morning to read. I would read standing in the supermarket line. I would read in the car while Linda was in the supermarket. I would read everywhere in order to get through the full complement of books so that when we all congregated in that room in New York, we would be able to bring to that conversation our very best arguments why the Sun in that particular year in fiction was the best entry versus the Orphan Master's Son. And in that room, those 16, 17 people, depending on the year and the staggered terms, everyone had a responsibility to argue, to make their pitch why the Son and not the Orphan Master's Son was the best of the 3 candidates. It really is a terrific experience, and I will never forget it. So, you know, like anything associated with people, we make mistakes. Probably there were cases of books, pieces of music over the years where we decided that should be the winner, and as I look back, I have second thoughts. I think that's going to be associated with any kind of award, but largely I would say I'm deeply proud of the awards that we gave and the decisions that we reached. They were almost always right. Just a quick story, and and then I'm going to open it up for questions. One of the things that the board does from time to time, usually every 10 or 15 years, is open up some categories for, say, special achievement, lifetime achievement, special acknowledgments of work and writers, historians who may in their time might have been overlooked. Or it's regarded as a way for the Pulitzer Prize board to sort of dip back into history, if you will, and offer some course correction. I was lucky enough to be on the board at a time when we were doing that with music. And if you look at American music, if you look at any discipline, you realize, especially in the early part of the 20th century, sometimes people won awards maybe not because the work was particularly good, but because maybe the politics at the time, maybe race, maybe gender. I mean, we know now as we look back that decisions in the past have not always been equal, shall we say. And so over the years, the Music Prize has been one example where we've been able to look back and recognize jazz musicians on occasion, African-American music that now we recognize it was a signature achievement, but at the time there was an inclination not to do that. So I happened to be in a subcommittee, a small group of 3 people back in 2010, given the task of examining the Music Prize over the previous 90-some years to try to sift through artists, musicians whose compositions might have been overlooked. Long story short, we ultimately, largely through my own personal experience, through my developing expertise in American music, brought forth and ultimately awarded a special Lifetime Achievement Award to Hank Williams, whose compositions, whose representation of the common man, if you will, in my view, and I think ultimately in the view of the board, represented an under-recognized achievement and influence in American music. So I will always have that. Not just my vote unsuccessful on the Sun, my vote successful on the Hemingses, but I have a sort of a special piece of that award, and I'll never forget being at the awards luncheon that year. Of course, Hank Williams is long gone, died when he was 29, but his entire family came on his behalf, including Hank Williams Jr., to accept the award on behalf of their father. And it was for me, having grown up in Kansas, having listened to my grandfather and my father sing Hank Williams songs to me and my family, it was a remarkable experience to be a part of granting that recognition, that Pulitzer Prize to a champion of American music. So it's a small thing, but for me, it's a very big thing, and I hope for the Williams family as well. Now, I want to open it up for questions, so I hope, Ted, Steve, is it okay if we spend some time? So I'm going to open it up, and anything on the prizes is fair game. So what do you want to know? Yeah.
You mentioned the several hundred-plus nominations.
Yep.
Say where these nominations come from.
Literally all over now they have to be American music, or American work. So it's a purely American prize. But if you, what's your first name? I forgot.
Joe.
Joe, if you were to publish a book in 2017, whether it's self-published or whether by Houghton Mifflin, you would be eligible to be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. You can nominate it yourself, or Houghton Mifflin can nominate it, or another can nominate it for you. As long as I think it's a $50 entry fee is paid, we will throw it in the hopper and see what happens, Joe. So that's your challenge. You have about 2 months now to get something done and to throw it into the hopper. But literally, anyone can qualify as long as that work was published in the year in which for which the prize is offered. Yes, ma'am.
So for the drama category, is that still true? Are you looking at works that were published?
Yep.
Or works that are performed?
No, it's no, published, because the award for drama is not for the performance, it's for the play. For the play itself. So yeah. So I'm glad you pointed out there are actual cases of, especially if the show maybe is first shown on Broadway, as often but not always the case, that when it's actually shown on Broadway, it may have actually been written in the year or two before that. In fact, I think it was a very close, some of you, I'm sure in this room, who has seen Hamilton? Is it maybe the best thing you've ever seen on the stage? I think he actually wrote that, he wrote it in which the year he was awarded for it, but the production was the following year. So you have to be careful there, but in the case of drama or music, it's for when it was actually first published as a work, not on the stage. Yeah, Steve?
Is there a Mr. or Mrs. Pulitzer?
I'm sorry about that. The problem is I assume too much. Thank you for asking that. Thank you for some of you may be familiar with the newspaper baron owner, a guy named Joseph Pulitzer, who was one of the signature media names in the late 19th and early 20th century. Joe Pulitzer came to this country as basically a penniless immigrant. And by his sheer intelligence and hard work and pluck, actually bought a bankrupt newspaper in St. Louis, Missouri, and turned that newspaper around in a period of short years into what over that time has become one of the great newspapers in America, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Later moved to New York and created the New York World and other newspapers, and the Pulitzer newspapers at the time became one of the dominant forces of American journalism and American society in the first 25 to 30 years of this country. Is that some of you know him, and does that match with your memory there? Of course, for many Americans, the name is faded, but in his will, he left money for two things: not to his family, but first establishing the first a graduate school of journalism at Columbia University in this country, and the balance of it created endowment for the Pulitzer Prizes. And it was Joe Pulitzer's dream for there to be an award for the best in American work, because at the time there was such a great influence from Europe, Western Europe in particular, on this country. And, here's Joe Pulitzer, a German immigrant, whose dream was to see a uniquely American prize for the best of work here. And out of that dream and out of his success and wealth came the endowment. So having served through most of my 9 years on the board, on the financial subcommittee, it was our job to make sure that Joe Pulitzer's endowment is safe and well invested. And that became quite an honor to know that I was part of three people who made sure that Joe Pulitzer's confidence in the prizes and in the American experience were safe and sound. And I think today his original $1 million investment is worth somewhere north of $40-some million, and that endows the prizes, pays for the prizes, as well as supporting scholarships. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the process that you were talking about.
Yeah.
probably not a fair comparison, but I hear about how in the Heisman trophies,
Oh,
there's campaigns for a couple.
oh, yeah.
How does that affect?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. If Joe back here, I'm just going to use him as example, let's say that his work is nominated, he doesn't know what its fate is until the entire process is over. So he can campaign all he wants to, but his first barrier is that group of 4 to 5 academics. If his book is fiction, for example, they're going to be writers and academics, English professors from across the country who sift through those applicants and get it to the first 3. They then bring it to the board, and the board decides. And long ago, people learned there's no point in lobbying; it's not going to get them anywhere. So there's no lobbying. Although my first couple of years, the only glimpse of that I received was having voted. We spent about a week or so at Columbia arguing, voting, and making the final decisions on the prizes. On my way home, people knew when the board met, although they didn't know until they were released the following week what we decided. It was not uncommon to get calls from people who hoped they were a finalist and who hoped that they would win, looking for, can you give me an idea? And of course the answer was always no, but that's the closest that the lobbying ever came. It's an amazing, after over 100 years, the process is as untouchable and as pure as it still is. So it is a remarkable achievement. Yes, sir.
Of the various genres in journalism and fiction, poetry, biography, etc., which did the board have the most difficulty coming to a consensus? And which were the easiest ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can think of no easy categories, but there are some that I think annually offered us particular grief. Part of that is the board's fault. The descriptions, if you will, they're on the Pulitzer.org website for each of the categories. In some cases are so vague as to sort of not offer any clear guidance to Joe, who wants to, maybe his book is a scholarly bent, but he's not clear whether it falls into nonfiction or history. There's a lack of clarity, I would say, on what history is versus nonfiction. So I think in both those categories, the board, I think it's okay to say, has wrestled with knowing from year to year, well, we have these great entries that have made it into the final 3 in each of those 2 categories, which is better on history and which is better on nonfiction. So I think we continue to wrestle and sort of find our way on that. And the fact is that depending on the pool, our decision may go here or there based on the pool. So I think those in particular have been difficult. Another one that's worth noting, because this past year, my last year on the board, we, for the first time, I think in the board's history, Pulitzer's history, all 3 finalists in the biography category were actually not biographies, but rather autobiographies. Never has that happened before. And so we were not only were they autobiographies, but 2 of the 3 were actually memoirs versus autobiographies. So would not rank as sort of academic works with the classic footnotes that you find in a work of history. So we were sort of charting new ground there, and we made the selections because we thought they were so remarkable and so memorable that they sort of forced their way to the top rank. So I think that is another area that we've really wrestled with. And finally, I know I'm getting the hook, is music. For the reasons I sort of indicated, I'm no expert on music. None of us actually are, really. We're generalists, most of us on the board. We know what we like, we know what we don't like, but understanding at a given time what the frontier of American music looks like today versus what we like the best, that's not always the same. And so understanding how tastes, popular tastes, and say rigor, academic rigor, intersect, that's kind of an area where there's a lot of gray area, a lot of subjective selection, and so we've screwed up in the past, I think, as a board, and we'll continue to feel our way in that area. I hope I've answered some questions. Thank you for your interest, actually, and I want you to know, again, this is such a terrific honor for me. I didn't seek it, and it was one of the great professional experiences of my life. And to me, it shines not a light, not on myself, but rather South Dakota. Sometimes you know how we are here. We think we're not good enough. We can't play with the big boys. That's something in the DNA here. And yet I'm convinced since coming here and adopting this as my home, we can play with the big boys. We're just as smart, and in many cases, even smarter than the other guys. And that to me is the lesson here, is that we have a lot of accomplishment here on the prairie, and we should celebrate that sometime. So thanks for letting me be here. Thank you.